Welcome everyone to week 15 of the reading group for Gurdjieff's All and Everything, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. This week we are reading chapter 20, The Third Flight of Beelzebub to the Planet Earth, which is, in my edition, page 207 to 226. Does anyone want to volunteer to do the reading this week?
I'll read if no one else does.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good to me. I'll hand it over to Nanya.
All right, Chapter 20, The Third Flight of Beelzebub to the Planet Earth. After a brief pause, Beelzebub continued to speak further as follows. This time I remained at home, that is, on the planet Mars, only a short while, just long enough to see and talk with those who had newly arrived and to give certain directions of a common tribal character. Having disposed of the said affairs, I descended again to your planet with the intention of continuing the pursuit of my aim, that is, the uprooting among these strange three-centered beings of their terrifying custom of doing as it were divine work by destroying the existence of beings of other brain systems. On this third descent of mine to the planet Earth, our ship occasion did not alight on the sea Colhidius, which is now called there Caspian Sea, but on the sea called at that period the Sea of Beneficence. We decided to alight on this sea because I wished this time to go to the capital of the beings of the second group of the continent Ashark, then named the city Gob, which was situated on the southeastern shore of that sea. At that time, the city Gob was already a large city and was well known over the whole planet for its production of the best fabrics and the best what are called precious ornaments. The city Gob was situated on both banks of the mouth of a large river called the Kirai Chai, which flowed into the Sea of Beneficence, and which had its rise in the eastern heights of this country. Into the Sea of Beneficence, on its western side, another large river flowed called the Narayachi, and it was in the valleys of these two large rivers that the beings of the second group of the continent Ashark chiefly existed. If you wish, my dear boy, I shall also tell you a little of the history of the rise of this group of beings of the continent Ashark, Beelzebub said to Hussein. Yes, grandfather, yes. I shall listen to you with great interest and much gratitude, replied his grandson. Then Beelzebub began. A long, long time before that period to which my present tale relates, namely, long before that second great catastrophe to that ill-fated planet, while the continent Atlantis was still existing, and at the height of its splendor, one of the ordinary three-centered beings of that continent invented, as my latest detailed investigations and researches cleared up, that the powdered horn of a being of that particular exterior form, then called a permar Pyrmorol was very effective against what they called diseases of every kind. His invention was afterwards widely spread by various freaks on your planet, and also there was gradually crystallized in the reason of the ordinary beings there an illusory directing factor, from which, by the way, there is formed in the whole of the presence of each of your favorites, especially of the contemporary ones, the reason of what is called their waking existence, which factor is the chief cause of the frequent change in convictions accumulated in them. Owing to just this factor, crystallized in the presences of the three brain beings of your planet of that period, it became the rule that anyone, as they say, who fell ill of some disease or other invariably had to be given this powdered horn to swallow. It is not without interest to remark that permerols bred there at the present time also, but since contemporary beings take them merely for one of the species of being they collectively call deer, they have no special name for them. So, my boy, as the beings of this continent Atlantis destroyed very many beings of that form for the sake of these horns, they very soon became extinct. Then a number of beings of that continent, who had by this time already made a profession of hunting these beings, went hunting for them on other continents and islands. This hunting was very difficult because for the capture of these permerols a great many of these hunter beings were required, so these professional hunters always took their whole families with them for assistance. Once several of these hunter families joined together and set off to hunt the permerols on a very remote continent then called Irananen, which later, after having been changed owing to the second catastrophe, was called the continent Ashark. This was the same continent your contemporary favorites now call Asia. For my further tales concerning these three brain beings, who have taken your fancy, it will be very useful for you, I think, if I emphasize here that on account of various disturbances during the second terrestrial catastrophe, several parts of the continent Aranen entered within the planet, and other terra firmas emerged in their place and attached themselves to this continent, which in consequence became considerably changed and became in size almost what the continent Atlantis had been for the planet Earth before the catastrophe. Well, then, my boy, while this said group of hunters were once with their families pursuing a herd of these permerals, they reached the shores of the water space which was later called the Sea of Beneficence. Both the sea itself and its rich and fertile shores so greatly pleased this group of hunters that they did not wish to return to the continent Atlantis, and from that time on they remained to exist there on those shores. That country was at that time indeed so excellent and so subtenennialian for ordinary being existence that no being who could think at all could help liking it. On that terra firma part of the surface of your planet, not only did there exist at that period multitudes of two-brained beings of the said exterior form, namely permerals, but around this water space were also multitudes of various kinds of fruit trees, whose fruit then still served for your favorites as the principal product for their first being food. There were then also so many of the one-brained and two-brained beings, which your favorites called birds, that when they flew in droves it became, as your favorites say, quite dark. The water space situated in the middle of that country, and then named the Sea of Beneficence, so abounded with fish that they could almost be caught, as they also say, with one's bare hands. As for the soil of the shores of the Sea of Beneficence, and also of the valleys of the two large rivers flowing into it, any part of them could be adapted for growing anything you like. In short, both the climate of this country and everything else so delighted the hunters and their families that none of them, as I have said already, as I have already said, had any desire to return to the continent Atlantis, and from that time on they remained there, and soon adapting themselves to everything, multiplied and existed, as is said, on a bed of roses. At this place in my tale I must tell you about an extraordinary coincidence which later had a great consequences for both the first beings of this second group and for their descendants of the most recent times. It seems that at the time when the said hunters from the continent Atlantis reached the Sea of Beneficence and decided to settle there, there was already existing on the shores of the same sea a being from the continent Atlantis who was at that very time very important and who belonged to the sect of Astrosovores, and who was a member of a learned society, the like of which has never since appeared on that planet Earth and probably never will. This learned society then existed under the name of Alkhaldun, and this member of the Alkhalduns reached the shores of the Sea of Beneficence on account of the following. Just before the second great catastrophe, those genuine learned beings then existing on the continent Atlantis, who had organized that truly great learned society there, somehow became aware that something very serious had to happen in nature, so they began to observe very carefully all the natural phenomena of their continent. But however hard they tried, they could in no way find out what precisely had to happen. A little later on, and with the same aim, they sent some of their members to other continents and islands, in order, by means of these common observations, perhaps to be able to find out what was impending. The members sent were to observe not only nature on the planet Earth, but also every kind of, as they then expressed themselves there, heavenly phenomena. One of those one of these members, namely the mentioned important being, had chosen the continent Arananan for his observations, and having migrated there with his servants, had settled on the shores of the said water space later called the Sea of Beneficence. It was just this same learned member of the Society Alcaldan who once chanced to meet certain of the mentioned hunters on the shores of the said Sea of Beneficence, and having learned that they had also come from the continent Atlantis, was naturally very glad and began to establish relations with them. And when, shortly afterwards, the continent Atlantis entered within the planet, and this learned Alcaldan member had no longer any place to return to, he remained to exist with these hunters in that future Maral Maralplace. A later A little later, this group of hunters chose this learned being as the cleverest to be their chief, and still later, this member of the great society Al Khaldan married the daughter named Ramallah of one of the hunters, and afterward shared fully in the lives of the founders of the beings of that second group of the continent Iranian, or as it is called at the present time, Asia. A long time passed. The beings of this place on the planet Earth were also born and were again destroyed, and the general level of the psyche of this kind of Earth beings was thereby changed, of course, at times for the better, at times for the worse. Multiplying, these beings gradually spread over this country more and more widely, although always preferring the shores of the Sea of Beneficence in the valleys of those two large rivers which flowed into it. Only much later, the center of their common existence was formed on the southeastern shore of the sea, and this place they called the city of Gob. The city became the chief place of existence for the head of the second group of beings of the continent Ashark, whom they called king. The duties of this king were here also hereditary, and this inheritance began with the first chosen chief, who was the said learned member of the learned society Al Khaldan. At the time to which the tale I began refers, the king for the beings of that second group was the grandson of his great grandson, and his name was Konuzion. My latest detailed investigation and researches show that there had been actualized by that same King Konuzion exceedingly wise and most beneficent measures for uprooting a terrifying evil which had arisen among the beings, who by the will of fate had become his subjects. And he had actualized these said most wise and beneficent measures for the following reason. The same King Canusione once constated that the beings of his community were becoming less and less capable of work, and that crimes, robberies, and violence, and many other such things had never occurred before, were on the increase among them, or, if they had occurred, had seemed to be quite exceptional phenomena. These constatations surprised and at the same time grieved King Canusione, who, after thinking deeply about it, decided to find out the causes of this sorrowful phenomena. After long observations, he finally cleared up for himself that the cause of the phenomena was a new habit of the beings of his community, namely, their habit of chewing the seed of a plant then called gullion. This planetary formation also arises on the planet Earth at the present time, and those of your favorites who consider themselves educated call it Pavavaroon, but the ordinary beings simply call it the poppy. Here it must without fail be noticed that the beings of Meroplesiae then only had a passion for chewing those seeds of the mentioned planetary formation which had without fail to be gathered at the time of what is called ripeness. In the course of his further close observations and impartial investigations, King Kunuzion clearly understood that these seeds contained something that could completely change for the time being all the established habits of the psyche of those beings who introduced this something into themselves, with the result that they saw, understood, felt, sensed, and acted quite otherwise than they were previously accustomed to see, sense, act, and so on. For instance, a crow would appear to them to be a peacock, a trough of water, a sea, a harsh clatter, music, goodwill, enmity, insults, love, and so on and so forth. When King Kunuzion became clearly convinced of all of this, he immediately dispatched everywhere trusted and faithful subjects of his strictly to command, in his name, all beings of his community to cease chewing the seeds of the mentioned plant. He also arranged for the punishment and fine of those beings who should disobey this order. Thanks to these measures of his, the chewing of the said seeds seemed to diminish in the country of Meroplesiae, but after a very short time it was discovered that the number of those who chewed had only seemingly diminished. In reality, they were even more than before. Having understood this, the wise King Canusion thereupon resolved to punish still more severely those who should continue chewing, and, at the same time, he strengthened the surveillance of his subjects and also the strictness of the enforcement of the punishment of the guilty. And he himself began going about everywhere in the city of God, personally examining the guilty and impressing them by various punishments, physical and moral. In spite of all of this, however, the desired result was not obtained, as the number of those who chewed increased more and more in the city of Gob itself, and corresponding reports from other places in the territories subject to him also increased daily. It then became clear that the number of those who had chewed had increased still more, because many of the three-brained beings who had never previously chewed now began chewing merely out of what is called curiosity, which is one of the peculiarities of the psyche of the three-brained beings of that planet which has taken your fancy, that is to say, curiosity to find out what effect those seeds had, the chewing of which was prohibited and punished by the king with such insistence and relentless severity. I must emphasize here that though the said particularity of their psyche began to be crystallized in your favorites immediately after the loss of Atlantis, yet in none of the beings of former epochs did it function so blatantly as it does now in the contemporary three-brained beings there. They have more of it perhaps than there are hairs on a tusuk. So, my boy, when the wise King Canusium finally became quite convinced that it was not possible, by the described measures, to extirpate the passion for chewing the seeds of the Gulion, and saw that the only result of his measures was the death of several who were punished, he abrogated all the measures he had previously taken and again began to think seriously about a search for some other real means for destroying this evil lamentable for his community. As I learned much later, owing to a very ancient surviving monument, the great King Canusion then returned to his chamber and for 18 days neither ate nor drank, but only very seriously thought and thought. It must be in any case he noticed here that those latest researches of mine show that King Canusion was then particularly anxious to find a means of uprooting this evil, because all the affairs of his community were going from bad to worse. The beings who were addicted to this passion almost ceased to work. The flow of what is called money into the communal treasuries entirely ceased, and the ultimate ruin of the community seemed to be inevitable. Finally, the wise king decided to deal with this evil indirectly, namely, by playing on the weaknesses in the psyche of the beings of his community. With this aim, he invented a very original religious doctrine corresponding to the psyche of the beings of that time, and this invention of his he spread broadcast among all his subjects by every means at his disposal. In this religious doctrine, it was said, among other things, that far from our continent, Ashark was a larger island where existed our Mr. God. I must tell you that in those days not one of the ordinary beings knew that besides their planet Earth other cosmic concentrations existed. The beings of the planet Earth of those days were even certain that the scarcely visible white points far away in space were nothing more than the pattern of the veil of the world, that is to say, just of their planet, as in their notions then, the whole world consisted, as I have said, of their planet alone. They were also convinced that this veil was supported like a canopy on special pillars, the ends of which rested on their planet. In that ingeniously original religious doctrine of the wise King Canusion, it was said that Mr. God had intentionally attached to our souls the organs and limbs we now have to protect us against our environment, and to enable us efficiently and profitably to serve both himself personally and the souls already taken to that island of his. And when we die and our soul is liberated from all these specially attached organs and limbs, it becomes what it should really be, and is then immediately taken just to this island of his, where our Mr. God, in accordance with how our soul with its added parts has existed here on our continent, Ashark, assigns to it an appropriate place for its further existence. If the soul has fulfilled its duties honestly and conscientiously, Mr. God leaves it for its further existence on his island. But the soul that here on the continent Ashark has idled or discharged its duties indolently and negligently, that has in short existed only for the gratification of the desires of the parts attached to it, or finally, has not kept his commandments, such a soul our Mr. God sends for further existence to a neighboring island of smaller size. Here, on the continent Ashark, exist many spirits attendant upon him, who walk among us in caps of invisibility, thanks to which they can constantly watch us unnoticed, and either inform our Mr. God of our doings or report them to him on the day of judgment. We cannot in any way conceal from them either any of our doings or any of our thoughts. It was still further said that, just like our continent Ashark, all of the other continents and islands of the world had been created by our Mr. God, and now existed, as I have said, only to serve him and the deserving souls already dwelling on his island. The continents and islands of the world are all places, as it were, for preparation and storehouses for everything necessary for this island of his. That island on which Mr. God himself and the deserving souls exist is called paradise, and existence there is just roses, roses. All its rivers are of milk, their banks of honey. Nobody needs to toil or work there. Everything necessary for a happy, carefree, and blissful existence is there, because everything requisite is supplied there in superabundance from our own and the other continents and islands of the world. This island paradise is full of young and lovely women of all the peoples and races of the world, and each of them belongs for the asking to the soul that desires her. In certain public squares of that superb island, mountains of various articles of adornment are always kept, from the most brilliant diamonds to the deepest turquoise, and every soul can take anything he likes, also without the least hindrance. In other public squares of that beatic, beatific island are piled huge mountains of sweetmeats, especially prepared with presents of poppy and hemp, and every soul may take as much as he pleases at any time of day or night. There are no diseases there, and of course, none of those lice or flies that give us all no peace here and blight our whole existence. The other, smaller island, to which our Mr. God sends for their further existence the souls whose temporary physical parts have been idle here and have not existed according to his commandments, is called Hell. All the rivers of this island are burning pitch. The whole air stinks like a skunk at bay. Swarms of horrible beings blow police whistles in every square, and all the furniture, carpets, beds, and so on there are made of fine needles with their points sticking out. One very salted cake is given once a day to every soul on this island, and there is not a single drop of drinking water there. Many other things are also there of a kind that the beings of earth not only would not like to encounter, but not even experience in thought. When I first came to the country of Meroplaciae, all the three-brained beings of that country were followers of a religion based on the just mentioned ingenious religious doctrine, and this religion was then in full bloom. To the inventor himself of this ingenious religious doctrine, namely the wise King Canusion, the sacred Roscuarno had occurred long before this time, that is to say, he had long previously died. But, of course, owing to once again to the strangeness of the psyche of your favorites, his invention had taken such a strong hold there that not a single being in the whole country of Meroplaciae then doubted the truth of its peculiar tenets. Here also in the city of Gob, from the first day of my arrival, I began visiting the Kaltaani, which were already called the Chai Hana. It must be noticed that although the custom of sacrificial offerings was also flourishing at that period in the country of Meroplaciae, it was not on the large scale of which it flourished in the country Tiklumiesh. There in the city Gob, I began deliberately looking for a corresponding being in order to make friends with him, as I had in the city of Korkalai. And indeed, I soon found such a friend here also, but this time he was not a priest by profession. My friend here turned out to be the proprietor of a large chaihana, and although I became, as it is said there, on very good terms with him, nevertheless I had that strange tie with him which arose in my essence toward the priest Abdul in the city Korkalai. Although I had already existed a whole month in the city Gob, I had neither decided upon nor undertaken anything practical for my aim. I simply wandered about the city Gob, visiting first the various chaihana, and the only later the chaihana of my new friend there. During this time I became familiar with many of the manners and customs of the second group, and also with the fine points of their religion, and at the end of the month I decided to attain my aim here also, through their religion. After serious pondering, I found it necessary to add something to the religious doctrine existing there, and I counted on being able, like the wise King Canusion, to spread this addition of mine effectively among them. Just then I invented that those spirits of caps of invisibility, who, as it was said in that great religion, watch our deeds and thoughts in order to report them later to our Mr. God, are none other than just the beings of other forms which exist among us. It is just they who watch us and report everything to our Mr. God. But we people not only fail to pay them their due honor and respect, but we even destroy their existences for our food as well as for our sacrificial offerings. I particularly emphasized in my preaching that not only ought we not to destroy the existence of the beings of the other forms in honor of Mr. God, but that, on the contrary, we ought to try to win their favor and to beseech them at least not to report to Mr. God those little evil acts of ours which we do involuntarily. And this addition of mine I began to spread by every possible means, of course, very cautiously. At first, I spread this invention of mine through my new friend there, the proprietor of the Chaihana. I must tell you that his Chayana was almost the largest in the whole city at Gob, and it was very famous for its reddish liquid, of which the beings of the planet Earth are very fond. So there were always a great many customers there, and it was open day and night. Not only did the inhabitants of the city itself go there, but also all the visitors from the whole of Meroplesiae. As I soon became quite expert in talking with and persuading individual customers as all those present in the Chaihana. My new friend himself, the proprietor of the Chaihana, believed my invention so firmly that he didn't know what to do with himself for repentance for his past. He was in constant agitation and bitterly repented his previous disrespectful attitude and his treatment of the various beings of other forms. Becoming day by day a more ardent preacher of my invention, he thereby not only helped to spread it in his own Chaihana, but he even began of his own accord to visit other Chaihana in the city Gob in order to spread the truth which had so agitated him. He preached in the marketplaces and several times made special visits to the holy places, of which there were then already many in the outskirts of the city Gob, and which had been established in honor or in memory of somebody or something. It is very interesting to remark here that the information that serves on the planet Earth for the rise of a holy place is usually due to a certain earth beings called liars. The disease of lying is also very widespread there. On the planet Earth, people lie consciously and unconsciously. They consciously lie there when they can obtain something personal material advantage by lying, and they unconsciously lie there when they fall ill with a disease called hysteria. In addition to the proprietor of the Chaihana there in the city Gob, a number of other beings very soon began unconsciously to assist me, who, like the proprietor of the Chaihana, had meanwhile become ardent supporters of my invention, and all the beings of that second group of Asiatic beings were soon eagerly spreading this invention of mine and persuading each other of it as an indubitable truth that had suddenly been revealed. The result of it all was that there in the country of Meroplesiae not only were sacrificial offerings indeed diminished, but they even began to treat the beings of other forms with unprecedented attention. Such comical farces very soon began there that though though I myself was the author of the invention, I nevertheless found it very difficult to refrain from laughter. Such comical farces occurred as, for instance, the following. A highly respectable and wealthy merchant of the city Gob would be riding in the morning on his donkey to his own shop, and on the way a motley crowd of beings would drag this respectable merchant off his donkey and thoroughly maul him because he had dared to ride on it. And then the crowd, bowing low, would escort the donkey on which the merchant had been riding wherever it chose to go. Or, what is called a woodcutter, would be hauling wood to market with his own oxen from the forest to the town. A mob of citizens would drag him off his cart, and after mauling him, very gently unyoke the oxen and escort them wherever they wished to go. And if the cart were seen in a part of the city where it might hold up the traffic, the mob of citizens would themselves drag the cart to the market and leave it there to its fate. Thanks to this invention of mine, various quite new customs were very soon created in the city Gob. As, for instance, the custom was established there of placing troughs in all the squares, public places, and at the crossroads of the town, where residents of the city Gob could in the morning throw their choicest morsels of food for dogs and other stray beings of various forms, and at sunrise throw into the sea of beneficence every kind of food for the beings called fishes. But the most peculiar of all was the custom of paying attention to the voices of beings of various forms. As soon as they heard the voice of a being of any form, they immediately began to praise the names of their gods and to await their blessing. It might be the crowing of a cock, the barking of a dog, the mewing of a cat, the squealing of an ape, or so on. It would always startle them. Here it is interesting to notice that for some reason or other they would always on these occasions raise their heads and look upwards, even though, according to their teaching of their religion, their God and his assistants were supposed to exist on the same level as themselves, and not where they directed their eyes and prayers. It was extremely interesting at these moments to watch their faces. Pardon me, your right reverence, interrupted at that moment Beelzebub's old devoted servant Ahun, who had also been listening with great interest to his tales. Do you remember, your right reverence, how many times in that same city gob we ourselves had to flop down in the streets during the cries of beings of different forms? To this remark Beelzebub said, Certainly I remember, dear Ahun. How could I forget such comical impressions? You must know, he then continued, turning to Hussein again, that the beings of the planet Earth are inconceivably proud and touchy. If someone does not share their views or agree to do as they do, or citizens or criticizes their manifestations, they are, oh, very indignant and offended. If one had the power, he would order whoever dared not to do as he did, or who criticized his conduct, to be shut up in the kind of room which is usually infested by innumerable what are called rats and lice. And at times, if the offended one had greater physical strength and an important power possessing being with whom he was not on very good terms was not watching him, he would simply maul the offender as the Russian Sidor once mauled his favorite goat. Very well, knowing this aspect also of their strange psyche, I had no desire to offend them and to incur their wrath. Furthermore, I was always profoundly aware to outrage anybody's religious feeling is contrary to all morality. So, when existing among them, I always tried to do as they did in order not to be conspicuous and attract their attention. Here it does no harm to notice that owing to the existing abnormal conditions of ordinary existence there among your favorites, the three-brained beings of that strange planet Earth, especially during recent centuries, only those beings who manifest themselves, not as the majority of them do, but somehow or other, more absurdly, become noticed and consequently honored by the rest. And the more absurd their manifestations, and the more stupid, mean, and insolent the tricks they play, the more noticed and famous they become, and the greater is the number of beings on the given continent and even on other continents who know them personally or at least by name. On the other hand, no honest being who does not manifest himself absurdly will ever become famous among other beings or even be simply noticed, however good natured and sensible he may be in himself. And so, my boy, what Arahun so mischievously reminded me about concerned just that custom which developed there in the city gob of attaching significance to the voices of beings of various forms, and particularly to the voice of what are called donkeys, at which there were then, for some reason or other, a great many in the city gob. The beings of all other forms of that planet were also manifest themselves by voice, but at a definite time. For instance, the cock cries at midnight, an ape in the morning when it is hungry, and so on. But donkeys there bray whenever it enters their head to do so, and in consequence you may hear the voice of that silly being there at any time of day or night. So, my boy, it was established there in the city gob that as soon as the sound of the voice of the donkey was heard, all who heard it had flopped down immediately and offer up prayers to their gods and to their revered idols. And I must add, those donkeys usually have a very loud voice by nature, and their voices carry a long way. Well, then as we walked along the streets of the city gob and saw the citizens flopping down at the brain of every donkey, we had to flop down likewise so as not to be distinguished from the others, and it was just this comical custom I see now that tickled our old Ahun so much. You notice, my dear Hussein, with what venomous satisfaction our old man reminded me, after so many centuries, of that comical situation of mine. Having said this, Beelzebub, smiling, went on with the tale he had begun. It is needless to say, he continued, that there also, in the second center of culture of the three-brained beings of your planet, breeding there on the continent of Ashark, the destruction of beings of other forms of sacrificial offerings entirely ceased, and if isolated instances occurred, the beings of that group themselves settled accounts with the offenders without compunction. Having thus become convinced that there also, among that second group of beings on the continent Ashark, I had succeeded so easily in uprooting for a long time the custom of sacrificial offerings, I decided to leave. But I had it in mind, in any event, to visit also the nearest large points where the beings of the same second group were breeding, and I chose for this purpose the region of the course of the river Moria Chai. Soon after this decision, I sailed with a hoon to the mouth of this river and began to sail up against its current, having become persuaded that there had already passed from the beings of the city gob to the beings of the group populating these large centers the same new customs and the same notions concerning sacrificial offerings by the destruction of the existence of other beings. We have finally arrived at a small town called Arguina, Arguina, which in those days was considered the most remote point of the country Maropolisier. Here also existed a fair number of beings of the second Asiatic group who were engaged chiefly in obtaining from nature what is called turquoise. There, in the small town of Arguina, I began, as usual, to visit their various chaihana, and there also I continued my usual procedure.
That's great. Thanks very much for reading. So there's a lot going on there as per usual. The things I think of the clearest things to discuss, which I've just sort of noted down, is one we can begin to discuss heaven and hell, which I think up until now Gurdjieff has just mentioned or Beelzebub has just mentioned in passing, and how heaven and hell might be understood in this case. There's also the notion of higher beings reporting to God and what it is for a higher being to report to God. And then near the end of this section, there was that lengthy idea of lying and donkeys, fame, celebrity, and insincerity in lying in relation to what it is people pay attention to. But I think I could just offer a few comments beginning with heaven and hell, and this, well, as Gurdjieff calls it, paradise, this paradise island where there is a moment there where I realised that there must be something tongue-in-cheek about this. Understandably, Gurdjieff's personal biographical relationship with women is very much of its time, and to a degree, I imagine many people now would say misogynistic, but there's definitely a lot of debate to be had about that, because I've always felt that actually he was fairly equal with his students as being men and women. There doesn't actually seem to be a divide between like what we'd consider, traditional roles of the household. There was men washing up, and this is in the 20s, for instance. So I don't think that's something that I don't think his relationship between men and like his different of how his attitude towards men and women differed in relation to what would be considered traditional gender roles, for instance. However, there is this moment within the Paradise section where he says that any, in quotation marks, which I think is very important, any soul in quotation marks who is in paradise simply obtains the woman that they desire belongs to them. And it was at that point you realize that I think Gurdjieff is being extremely tongue-in-cheek about what paradise and hell are. And of course he's sort of outlined that this is this fiction that's been created, and it's developed as this extremely human in relation to the Kundabuffa fiction, which basically you can understand comports people to do in certain directions, being in hell or being in heaven. And the idea of hell is this thing which will lead you towards this paradise. But the paradise that Gurdjieff outlines is so utterly ridiculous. I think he's making it so ridiculous, rivers of milk and banks of honey and women who just suddenly desire you. I think he's making it so ridiculous as to see that basically the development of an internal heaven can become this subjective thing which arises from these fictitious creations of the Kundabuffa. So you just develop your own heaven and go like, if I do this, then I'm good. And I think really the point he's trying to make is actually ironically one that many atheists make, especially new atheists, but Gurdjieff makes it in such a way that I think it leads you towards a deeper understanding of why it's important for religion. So that one of the point he seems to be making, at least for me, is that it's any virtuous act or any act of true goodness and truth can't be undertaken in the understanding that you do it just so you either get to paradise or don't end up in hell. To do so in that sense is therefore entering into a lie, because the reason you do it isn't for the reason itself. You're not being good for goodness itself. You're being good so you don't end up in hell, which itself is a very selfish, in a way, a selfish act. So ironically, this thing that new atheists say actually leads us towards, they make that argument. How can you consider yourself a good person if you only do so for reward? And I think actually Gurdjieff is making his same argument, but he's sort of twisting that on its head. Or, well, he's not twisting it on its head, the new atheists are, because they came later. But the argument then would be is that how can you call yourself a religious person, a truly religious person, if you only are enacting these religious tenets which you believe to be true only because you get reward or only out of fear of punishment, whereas a true, sincere person who isn't lying to themselves or self-justifying would be a good person out of pure goodness and truth itself. So it leads us back once again to the we spoke about this before, of the idea of why it is you're truly doing something, and how um, you can only become an altruist from an egoist, right? You need to understand why it is you are doing something before you can really be said to be doing it for a certain reason. Until then, you could just be doing it automatically. And it seems that the heaven and hell that Gurdjieff is outlining here are completely these are automatic functions. These are like fictions which pull the robot around as a means to do it. They're just developed elsewhere. Um, I believe, though someone else may have to correct me on this, I believe this is a Gnostic outlook, that heaven and hell are immanent things which, they're places that you can exist in within Earth, but they're really entirely otherwise. But I'm not too sure on that one. But if there's a few other things we can talk about here, celebrity and higher beings. But does anyone really have any more thoughts about this passage, or any thoughts on this heaven and hell idea?
Yeah, I think look, the heaven and hell thing comes directly after the poppy seed consumption, right? So that seems like a big uh, impetus for the construct,
Mm. Yeah.
right? I mean,
Sorry.
no, yeah. Well, I think I saw something that Orage had said about the poppy seed being these like false values or something, but I didn't know if there was much more to it because it kind of jumps from the poppy seed or whatever that kind of causes this destruction amongst like moral values and cohesion of society. So you kind of the king is forced to construct this heaven and hell paradigm to help people or something.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, in the passage, they are constructed in light of the poppy seed, sort of people trying to escape reality. It seems, via sort of drug use, and Gurdjieff's, it's quite humorous actually. Gurdjieff's references to drugs and alcohol. There's a part later on around pages 400 in the second, just at the start of the second book. He outlines like 5 drugs, and one of them is cocaine. Like, he makes cocaine come across as this very common thing, which I believe it was in this era. I mean, we look at, when I was reading it, I was thinking about Freud, and around this era, I believe, I might have got my dates wrong, but he's literally prescribing cocaine to many of his patients. So it's a super, super common drug. And I believe the poppy seed thing would be both contextual. I imagine Gurdjieff's upbringing led him to be commonly around poppy seeds. So, I mean, the reason I outline that is whether or not it's correct to really think of this as just a metaphor for, like drug use in relation to escapism, right? These people are escaping to, they don't, as he says, they don't want to do the work. They don't want to sort of put effort into real life. So they're just escaping, and the drug use sort of keeps ramping up until the point where he has to develop this fiction. So I guess the question there is, like, of which of those escapes is actually healthier or better? They're both still existing in this state of a lie. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, the poppy seed thing, I can't quite work out. I mean, is it as clear as this idea that escaping off into a false reality via drugs is obviously a bad thing, or is there something else going on there? I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts. I mean, did you have any more thoughts on that, Chaz?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you because the pot, like obviously where he grew up, the poppy seed's like a thing. And I think even in the book he references hemp too. So yeah, I mean, drugs maybe not metaphorical, but I don't know. I had seen something that Raj made it into a bigger deal, but I don't know. I don't really. It's just kind of odd.
Hmm. Yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts on the poppy seeds?
I don't know. I guess I found like the correlation between just like the whole concept of just, like, I guess for a contemporary comparison, like the, crack epidemic in the ghettos and just how that kind of swept through the community and destroyed any semblance of, family and community, and degraded the whole environment for everyone so much that, that this similar kind of story kind of transpired. And because of that arose this need to create this fiction of heaven and hell, based on, well, and that's another thing that I find kind of conflicting is, you have Beelzebub saying that the whole idea of heaven and hell was just made up by this king in order to deal with this problem at this one time back in the day. That was kind of interesting to me. But it seems like it's a common thread throughout, humanity's history that we have a weakness and are susceptible to these types of influences, and we don't necessarily have the ability by ourselves in order to overcome those temptations, and how they substances affect us individually, and collectively we can just diminish ourselves into this state of just despair, and will destroy our whole, our the actual paradise that we're actually living in for a made up paradise, I guess.
Yeah, and that seems to be the. It's interesting you state this. I mean, it seems that the poppy seed, I think we can understand. Like, you were referencing the crack epidemic. We can say that we can think of weed, cocaine, Christ, meth, MDMA, whatever, all the modern ones. I'm now realizing that we've developed a ton more. But anything now, every I imagine every culture in time has its own equivalent of what Gurdjieff is referencing to here as a poppy seed, which basically it seems that everyone there is then susceptible to something else, right? That this actually made everyone there susceptible to the thing that followed. It made them susceptible to the experience of another person. And in taking these drugs, you might. This is sort of one of the brilliant things that John Michael Greer actually said to me, which I think I can bring in as relevant here, which is that often the New Age, not that I'm including Gurdjieff in that, but New Age mysticism, esotericism, and whatever the word occultism means, these often get conflated and mistaken for that other culture of like experimental drug use. And there is definitely a sincere overlap at certain points. I'm thinking of Huxley's Heaven and Hell, for instance, is one point, and I do believe that Uspensky, when he first meets Gurdjieff in the beginning of In Search of the Miraculous, actually mentions to him about drug use, and Gurdjieff sort of says something along the same lines of as what John Michael Greer said to me, which is like, what people don't realize is that a lot of mysticism is in your basic, to put it long story short, in one's attempts to figure out what reality is, they hamper themselves in doing that by beginning from something that they absolutely know isn't reality. So in taking drugs and experimenting with drugs, that can be a thing which is can be used. But before that, you have to figure out what reality is, and you can't do that from a place which you aren't in control of, or absolutely isn't reality, right? So these escapes that are in drugs, they're sort of like if there's 1,000 paths, or no, let's say there's paths in the road. Taking drugs leads you before you even know at the end of that path it's the wrong one. You already know it's the wrong one because your feet aren't even on the ground, right? It's a path that's just going to take you where it wants to take you. So it sort of heightens your susceptibility to another's experience, as opposed to being able to deal with, the experience that you're given. It's just a heightening of suggestibility in a way. But equally, if someone wants to bring in here something that isn't as anti, because obviously I'm personal bias here, I am very anti-drugs, so it probably doesn't help my reading of it. But yeah, but it perhaps the problem is that there is a double susceptibility, right? In being susceptible to the quote unquote poppy seed, whatever that may be, that leads you into an escapism you believe to be in control of, and thereby you then believe whatever is given to you. So it's like a double susceptibility and suggestibility. You're one of your sort of indulgent eyes is being suggestible to your own self. You're suggesting something to yourself, which then means that anything that's given to you from then you sort of take as true. So you're led down this like a labyrinth of incorrectness, right? If you open one incorrect door, then the rest that come along are also just going to be wrong. You need to begin with your feet on the ground, basically. Or as they say, head on your shoulders, right? If you're people, quite literally, if you think about the terminology used for drugs, there's a shop near me actually called Head in the Clouds, and that's quite literally what happens with you with drugs. Your head's in the clouds, thereby it can just float anywhere, whereas you need your head on your shoulders, connected to the earth, rooted in actual reality, before you can say, right, I'm now going to try to figure out what reality is and what it is to be. You can't do that when you're dragged elsewhere. At least that's my thoughts on it.
I think it can extend out to just whatever you want to call it, the myth of modernity, of progress, or all the other stuff you've kind of written about in the past. It's all this, I don't know, not to get too down, it's all pedantic bullshit, right? The same thing with the drug trip, like being some kind of revelatory achievement.
Well, it's all very easy things to, with a drug trip. But well, I haven't really ever been on many, but from the people I've spoken to, most of it were very boring. But you are given an outline of like a reality, and I think because you're given a reality, much like the idea of progress, you're given this very easily understood. You're given the whole of reality at once, right? Everything's suddenly unified. So it's like you're presented with a whole. It's like putting on a VR headset. You're presented with a virtual reality, which now seems so much more rational because you are presented with all the rules, all the logic, all the space and time constraints all at once. Whereas our reality, as it's experienced normally, isn't experienced like that, which is what Gurdjieff, and just for instance, the original title of In Search for the Miraculous, which I believe some editions still have as a subtitle, is I believe it's Notes of a Fragmented Teaching. Fragments of a Lost Teaching, and that fragmentary nature is something that Gurdjieff and Ouspensky both allude towards, which is there isn't this unified thing, that anything like that where it's like this is how the world works is immediately suspicious, because, well, to what degree can we say that we've worked things out? So progress as well, I think you could bring that in and say, oh, things just get better, do they? There's so many different variables to that it would be silly. It's sort of silly to say that. And the same thing with drug trips. But there is some sensible people who take drugs. I have spoken to them, because ultimately in taking drugs, you are just asking the same questions about reality again, but you're doing so from a place where you have less control. The reality of what happens in a DMT trip and the reality of what happens now, it's like, well, you still have the same sensible faculties to attend to these realities, but in one of them you're even less able to be aware of it. So I don't think it, yeah. One thing I'd add in actually as well is that it's interesting that the higher beings report to God, and I think Gurdjieff is sort of making it out that the idea of reporting to God in terms of a higher being. So we've spoken about what it is to be a higher being before, and drawing in the influence of the higher levels of the ray of creation. I think the idea of report, perhaps maybe the etymology of that word would help us out in some way, but obviously in a very human sense we think of reporting as if like we go off to some office somewhere and you hand a note over to God and he sort of checks it and says, oh, that's what's happening. But it's interesting to think about it in terms of when someone becomes a higher being, the absolute, of course, God is in all things in that way, or is able to understand all things. So in reporting to God, it's not that you report to God in that sort of didactic fashion where you pray and be like, right, this and this and happen. This has happened today. I want to repent for this. Here's my report of how I'm doing and what's going on. The report is immediate. It's like that's your internal process and experience of your experience of being a person, of experiencing life, is in itself inherently the report that you give to God. So in that sense, the higher beings report to God by the fact that they've attained higher beings, and therefore they can understand what's going on with lower beings. So it's almost like perhaps you could see it as authoritative, but it seems to me a more wholesome idea that the higher beings are there really to help us and to guide us on, but it's through their sort of teaching that you can begin to report to God in a more wholesome way. So like back to the whole idea of heaven and hell, in the sense of having an internal heaven and hell, right? That whole famous Abraham Lincoln quote of like, when I do bad I feel bad, when I do good I feel good. That internal consciousness is itself the act of reporting. It's not the repentance afterwards where you for instance, if you were to commit a sin, if you are someone with that internal conscience, then surely prior to, and if you then see it through during the act of committing that sin, you are reporting yourself to God when you're doing that. And I think in that sense, higher beings have that understanding of being able to stop these habitual behaviors prior to them being undertaken. So it's like you can't really avoid the that, and which is why one of Gurdjieff's more famous quotes about um, forgiving an ignorant sin is actually quite easy, right? If you're ignorant of a sin and then afterwards you realized, this happens a lot when you're younger, you're ignorant, you can only go off the experiences you had when you were younger. So, you know, to blame yourself for those things is silly, and to ask for repentance, it's clear, you didn't know any better. You'd be forgiven, but to ask for forgiveness for a sin which you committed knowing it's a sin, that's, as Gurdjieff says, is extremely difficult. So that whole idea of reporting seems to be more of an internal process, thereby connecting that with celebrity and also with the kunda buffer, thereby makes any process of sin simply a further function of the kunda buffer, in the fact that you are just undertaking self-deceit and self-justification and lying. Like, you're lying to yourself, which is one of the worst things you can do, because you can't lie to yourself. It's impossible. But so that's my thoughts that maybe draw a few threads together.
Personally, I kind of wondered what Gurdjieff would think of our age of celebrity that we have going on now after reading his description of why people get famous to begin with. I'm like, oh, that pretty much sums it up.
I think Sorry, were you going to say some more?
No, I was just like, it just kind of reminds me of like YouTube celebrity culture. That one paragraph where people get famous for their being as the more stupid and more mean tricks that they play, the more famous they become. I thought that was kind of interesting. That's
Yeah.
all.
I think I'll post it in the Discord fairly soon, perhaps as a text document. But I think I mentioned it before that I reached out to Paul Beekman Taylor, who is there's of what we know, there is 3 people still alive now, who knew Gurdjieff and actually worked with him. And Paul Beekman Taylor is one of them. And I had the privilege of, he said, yeah, I'll answer you. I wanted to interview him over the phone, but he doesn't talk on phones, so it's unfortunate. But he did grant me we chatted over email, and he answered quite a few questions. And one of the ones I asked, actually, Nanya, was, what do you think Gurdjieff would make of sort of the acceleration of the Kunda buffer and its effects in the modern world? Because it seems to me that a lot of what Gurdjieff was talking about, and the wrongness of the world and the Kunda buffer and the narcissism and the self-deceit and the celebrity, etc., etc., and the lying and the greed and the worry and the anxiety and everything, has just been ramped up to an unimaginable extent. And he said he believes, at least, that Gurdjieff would say that actually this is better for us, that we are surrounded by this, because you have more things to learn from, as something to push from, as something to not be subsumed into. Whereas it's more difficult to sort of grow as a person if you are perhaps existing as sort of a monk in solitude, living an ascetic life in the mountains. What is there for you to understand your own Kunda buffer processes from if you don't have these outlets? So, but Taylor sort of made it clear that the modern world is almost an asset in that sense. So, yeah, and I think in terms of what Gurdjieff would make of the celebrity, I'm not sure he'd probably be astounded, as many people would be if they came forward in terms of the innovation of how celebrity gets through to us. But I don't know if he would actually be surprised, because he understood that, well, this is what happens. People love lies, and they love comfortable lies, and they love lying, and it's interesting to think about lying in that sense. Think of YouTube creators and things along those lines, as you've mentioned. It doesn't seem to be a lie to us, right? There's someone just doing pranks on YouTube who becomes a celebrity. That doesn't seem to be a lie, but it is a lie about being and about what it is to be, I think, for Gurdjieff. And I think that itself is very destructive. And I think that's why, I think this is also why Gurdjieffians generally have, especially within mystical circles, have a reputation for being very zealous and very blunt, is because they, over time, have come to respect honesty to a degree which isn't normal in the modern world. You know, someone says, "How are you?" You don't reply honestly, and even if you were to reply honestly, you'd still probably hold something back. You know, and then just to give an example and maybe something just to think on, because I don't really have an example for it. If someone you were talking to was engaged in idle talk and they said like, you know, bad weather we're having today, you know, oh, bad weather it is today, like if it was raining, what actually is the honest answer for that for you? You know, is the honest answer something like, to be honest, I'm not interested in this conversation? Is it, well, actually, I quite enjoy rain? Is it, can you please shut up? I really don't care. Is it to be silent? And the idea of what honesty is in each of these situations is very difficult, I think. So yeah. But yeah. But it also sheds light on what a celebrity exactly is as well. So does anyone have any further comments or things they want to say about this section? No. Okay. Yeah, really great week this week. Great reading. Thanks very much, Nunya. Sorry. It will be. Let me check my calendar because I think from now on it will be. Yeah, it'll be Mondays again from now on. The Gurdjieff group's off for the summer, so we're not stopping for the summer. So yeah, if anyone knows anyone who'd want to join this group, it'd be great. And we're still retaining sort of 6 to 10 people, which is good. I think what I may do soon, because a lot of people who may want to join this work are probably quite daunted that we're now at we'll be at week 16, but it's only week 16 of what, 81, 84, 81. So what I may do in the weeks coming up, I may have like another thing one night, which is a lot longer, where anyone who wants to join the group but feels daunted, I could give like an overview of clear Gurdjieffian things, maybe as a live stream or something, and people can ask questions, and that will allow people to then be able to join, because I personally think you could basically join this book at any point, because it's so folded into itself, right, that certain terms start at the start, certain terms come up way later but are used all over the place, and it's all allegory and critical thinking, and so I think other people can join. So yeah, it'd be good to bolster the group. But it's been a great week again, and I will see you all next Monday for week 16 next Monday. Thanks for coming.